After the crash of 2008, I'd fallen on hard times. Really hard times. I'd lost my home and my marriage, which was kind of on the slide anyway, and now I was on the road. Not beatnik style, more like on the brink of starvation style. About the one saving grace was that I never took to booze or drugs. Not really my style. So the pittance of social security payments would just about keep me from starving, but I didn't have a roof over my head. I live in a part of the country where it gets cold in the winter, so once the season turned, I couldn't sleep outside anymore. With the economy being in ruins back then, there was usually somewhere vacant. It could be a battle to find somewhere for more than a few nights though. Then I'd have to start all over again. One night in the winter of early 2009, I was in that position. It was getting really cold, and I wasn't in a very good part of the city. Now, people would probably be as intimidated by me as I was by them. Even still, it's dangerous being a homeless person. I saw a deserted warehouse, which had a sign on it advertising that they were going to turn it into some gentrified lofts. But there was no security or evidence of any building work around, so I figured the project had probably crashed along with the rest of the economy. Even if there was some sort of security, I really was past caring at that point. And getting arrested and put in a warm cell for the night would be a jackpot. I climbed through a gap in a boarded up doorway. Walking in, I found myself in a completely vacant lower level. Just 4 walls and a concrete floor. I was expecting to find other homeless people, but maybe they thought the place was secured. The entire space had been cleared out, and I was staring at about 10,000 square feet of emptiness. This was better than outside, but not much. Cold air was drafting through the empty space, and my sleeping bag was about as thick as a tablecloth. I noticed a set of stairs heading up to a higher floor, so I set out for them. As I did, I thought I heard movement from the floor above. A footstep or something dropping, perhaps. I stopped and stood still, listening out. Complete silence. I dismissed it and continued on towards the stairs. I made it up to the second floor, moving silently. My shoes were so old and worn that I was practically walking barefoot at this point. Now that can be a good thing or a bad thing. Good if you want to go undetected, but bad if you surprise someone who might react very badly. As I set foot on the upper floor, my spirits rose. There were a series of rooms all along a narrowish corridor. There'd be no heat, of course, but it would provide shelter. I made to walk through the first door I saw, before realizing that it would make a lot more sense to occupy one of the rooms in the middle. There may not be much warmth in the building, but it would be much warmer at the centre where the wind couldn't whistle through. I moved silently towards the centre of the rooms in the corridor, and then stopped. I thought about which room to go in before deciding that one was as good as the other, so I purposefully grabbed the handle and walked in. Then everything seemed to freeze, as though the world just stopped. The door opened into an empty office space. Though the light was dim, what I saw was unmistakable. A tall, dark figure stood in the corner of the room, looking down. He was looking down on another dark figure, who was kneeling over a body, stretched out motionless. The heads of both of the figures snapped towards me as they turned around. The tall, dark figure's face contorted with rage. The kneeling figure was a ball of hair with a mouthful of rotting teeth that snarled at me. The face was so hideous, I wasn't even sure if it was human. He screamed, "Get out!" Startled by this, I sprang toward the corridor, noticing out of the corner of my eye that the tall dark figure was setting off in pursuit. I hadn't attempted to run in my pitiful shoes before, and of course, when I tried to get the hell out of there, a flapping part of the sole tripped me up. As I hit the ground, I quickly turned around to see the tall dark figure advancing towards me with a steely flash in his hand. In a second he was above me, but I instinctively kicked up my feet and pushed him stumbling back down the corridor. As I tried to get up, I noticed a piece of metal piping beside me. As the tall, dark figure advanced again, I hurled it with all my might. And to my amazement, my aim was perfect. It struck him squarely in the head, sending him reeling onto the floor. Wasting no time, I staggered downstairs and out of the warehouse, assuming these people or things or whatever they were would be after me. I kept moving all night from one end of the city to the other. By the next morning, I was hitchhiking my way out of state. I never went to the police. Don't ask me why, I guess it's kind of a homeless person's code. I don't know what was really going on that night, and I don't want to know. Occasionally it comes to my mind, but I've turned my life around now. I'm married with a couple of wonderful kids, living a suburban lifestyle. No one even knows that I was once a bum, and that one night I witnessed something horrifying. I work in the media industry, mainly television, but online media too. The story I'm about to tell you may sound familiar, but there's a twist. You may have heard some years ago about this guy called Kurt Barker. He had this well-known ghost hunting show, which did pretty well in the ratings on cable. Anyway, tragically, Kurt was filming the show at an old abandoned penitentiary in the Midwest when he had a sudden heart attack and died. At least, that was the story that came out. When they filmed the show, they really did it run and gun. There was just Kurt and a cameraman, and they had a guy who came with them and hung around outside whatever building they were in. He helped with the equipment, miking Kurt up and so forth, then stuck around in case anything happened and they needed help. But it was just Kurt and a cameraman in there. His cameraman, Pete, was a really good friend of mine. We graduated from the same year at media college, worked in the same company, and stayed really good friends. When the tragedy with Kurt happened, you can imagine that hit him pretty hard. But I was surprised at just how hard. It really knocked him down. He didn't want to talk to anybody, see anybody, do anything. It's natural to be upset when something like that happens, but it wasn't like him and Kurt were big buddies or anything. I tried to be a good friend, taking things slowly and being patient with him. Sometimes I would just go and sit with him in his apartment. He'd stare out the window and say nothing from the moment I arrived till the moment I left. Over a period of months, he started to slowly come out of it. He was drinking a little too much though. I started drinking with him. I thought I was helping, but I eventually realized that was doing more harm than good. During one of those sessions, he began talking about the night in the abandoned prison. Everything had been going normally. They were shooting the episode. They'd gone in and out of rooms and places that were supposed to be haunted, uncovering little of interest, even in the execution chamber in the condemned cell. Then, just after midnight, as they were about to leave, they began to hear strange noises coming from the area of the execution chamber. Kurt thought it was too good to miss, and Pete confirmed that he had enough battery and memory to keep shooting. So they hurried back to the area. Pausing to set up the shot and do the piece to camera, Kurt said his lines and then he pulled open the heavy steel door to the execution chamber. Pete stepped to the side as the door swung open, with a side profile of Kurt and the door in shot. Then as the door came fully open, through his viewfinder, he saw Kurt's face wide-eyed in sudden terror, and he let out a horrifying, blood-chilling scream before falling to the floor, stone dead. Pete put down his camera and tried to help Kurt, but it was obvious there was nothing he could do. Then, without pausing to pick up the camera, he turned and looked inside the chamber to see what Kurt had seen. "What was it?" I asked, my heart pounding. "What was it?" Pete opened his mouth slowly, as if trying to put into words something that was almost impossible to describe. His face contorted in terror, and he let out a scream before burying his head in his hands. I stayed silent, cursing myself for bringing that night back to him. We never spoke of it again. Pete had something of a relapse after that. One day, he abruptly quit his job, disappeared from his apartment, and I've never seen or heard from him again. There's an abandoned building at the far end of town. In winter, you can see it just standing there, cold and dark. In summer, when the leaves are on the trees, it seems to peer over them menacingly. It's always there, and it's always on my mind. No one seems to know what it was. It's been abandoned for that long. My dad says it was an asylum for the criminally insane. He also says to stay away from it. Many years ago, a kid from his high school was believed to have gone missing there. Dad wasn't sure if he really went missing at all. He was kind of the class weirdo. He'd run away from home before, and he'd been seen in and around that abandoned building, sleeping rough. Then one time, he disappeared for good. Maybe he just hit the road, maybe not. Dad said it was better not to take chances. But my bedroom window looked right out on that old abandoned building. On long summer nights, I'd be watching TV or playing video games, and I just couldn't stop looking out at it. The darker it got, the more I looked. It gave me a little chill of fear and excitement. I was young and stupid, so despite what Dad said, one night I couldn't resist anymore. I waited till everyone was in bed. Then a while after midnight, I snuck quietly out of the house and headed for that old abandoned building. It seemed unusually quiet that night. I know people always say that, and it might have just been my anticipation, but it was. There were no car radios or drunken yelling, nothing. Okay, it was a small town, but no one was around, not even a dog walker. All the while I walked, the old insane asylum loomed more gradually into view. Just like when I was at home, I couldn't stop looking at it. It seemed to look back. My eyes played tricks. I thought I saw fleeting figures in the rotted windows. Just moonlight, maybe. Before I knew it, I stood outside the rickety gate, looking at the shattered 4 stories with a grim, foreboding tower in the middle, where smoke would once have come from. Now it just hung over me in darkness. There was a keep out sign on the pathetic gate that hung lamely. It wasn't needed. No one ever came. Not teenage lovebirds, junkies or drug dealers, homeless or drunks. Just me. I started down the gravel road to the building. The crunch of my footsteps seemed uncommonly loud. I felt sure someone would hear me, except there was no one there to hear anything. The main door was missing, but inside was a set of double doors. My hand slightly trembling, I reached out to open them. Nothing moved. This was my chance to turn around. If they're locked, there's nothing I can do. But I stayed. I had to. Pushing and pulling at the double doors that seemed welded together with neglect, they suddenly gave way with a huge crack that would have wakened the dead. It echoed throughout the vast, empty hallway inside. If there was anything, or anyone there, my arrival had been well and truly announced. I stepped into the blackness with a small belt torch I'd brought along. There were slates everywhere, and rocks and debris all around underfoot. It just made my progress noisier. Going left out of the hallway, I came to another large room. I was surprised to see furniture. Easy chairs, sofas, an old coffee table with a backgammon board on it, an ancient radio in the corner. I'd expected the place to be vandalised. Then it dawned on me, no one ever came here. It was obviously some sort of patient lounge or staff or visitor lounge. I continued into a connecting room. It was much the same. I felt bolder. Now I was going to head upstairs. Then it happened. I thought it was a breath of wind whistling through an empty window frame, but as my senses heightened, it seemed to form a tune. I listened even more intently. One line of the song stuck in my head. You belong to me. I thought I'd spoken it for a moment, but I wasn't speaking. Surely it couldn't be. Was it a voice in my head? Or a voice in the room? I heard it clearly. You belong to me. Panic seized me. I flung myself into a sprint out of the room. In my panic, I tripped over a pile of slates and fell headlong into the coffee table in the lounge, sending the backgammon board sprawling. Stunned, I looked up, and in my stunned state thought I saw a sneering figure of a very old man in one of the chairs. I heard a voice say, "Once you come, you'll never leave." Fear supercharged me and I stumbled toward the door. I dropped my torch, but the fear led me back to the double doors, the voices still ringing in my ears. As I reached the doors, I found to my horror that they were stuck shut again. Pulling with all my might, they crashed open noisily, merging with the voices. I ran as fast as I could, heart thumping. Not like the heart pounds in exercise, the way the heart pounds in terror. I ran all the way home, then sat outside until I could compose myself before sneaking back in. I played it straight the next morning and never told my parents, or anyone else for that matter. From that day on, the old building still looked at me when I sat in my room, but I never looked back. And if anyone ever asked me about the place, I said stay away. Don't ever go there. A couple of years ago, me and a friend that we'll call Jim decided to hike the Appalachian Trail. We were pretty experienced hikers, so we thought we'd go big and hike the whole thing. It's about 2,200 miles and takes months, so it's not for the faint-hearted. But lots of people older than us had done it. However, there was a darker side to the trail. Many people have died there, many have disappeared, and no one really knows what happened to them. The fact that there were two of us made us confident, and we were all in. I was working a dead-end job at the time, so had no problem quitting that and hiking for a few months. Jim came from a pretty wealthy background, so he could pursue his interests without having to worry. We did things properly and had it all planned out. At the end of April, we stood excitedly at the trailhead and we were on our way. The first week went really well. We hiked a good distance every day, then either spent the night in one of the many hostels along the way or camped out in the open. Once we got into the second week, things started to change a bit. Like I said, Jim comes from a comfortable background. This was starting to cause a bit of a problem. He didn't like roughing it and wanted to slow down a bit and take longer. I had only allowed for these few months on trail. Sooner or later, I had to get back to reality and pay the bills, so I needed to plough ahead like we agreed. After some minor disagreements, we finally had a blow-up. Faced with a long day's hike, Jim didn't want to leave, favouring an extra day at the hostel. He finally grudgingly left, but he was complaining and remonstrating all the way. Finally, we came to a halt and exchanged words. He demanded that we go back and wait a day. I refused. Then we did something hikers should never do. We split. He went back, and I continued on, with a vague promise to meet up again in a few days when he had recharged his batteries and walked through a scheduled rest day. I felt bad about the whole thing as I trudged on, and he probably did too, but we were both a bit pig-headed. In a way, he might have had a point. As the day wore on, whether it was the argument or whether I really did need rest, I started to feel dog-tired. I wasn't even halfway to that night's hostel, and I was getting slower. My better judgment would have had me turn around, but I just couldn't do it. As the light started to fade that evening, I realised I would have to camp out by myself, which wasn't ideal. I kept going, trying to get as close to the hostel as I could before settling down. A few hundred yards down the trail, I rounded a bend and was surprised to see a man standing there. He wasn't a hiker either. No backpack or hiking boots, just a regular middle-aged guy, bearded with slightly long hair and a warm, welcoming smile. "Hello there," he said. "Little late to still be making trail, ain't it?" I stopped and took a breath, and before I knew it, I was chatting to him about my day. His name was Bob, and he was very friendly and very knowledgeable about the area. Then out of the blue he said, "You're welcome to stay with me and the family tonight. We live just back of the trail here. We've taken in a lot of hikers over the years, and it's almost dinner time." He seemed like such a nice guy. He mentioned his family and previously taken in hikers, and I was dead on my feet, so it sounded good. We headed off up a track that ran north of the trail, towards a modest farmhouse. Smoke rose gently from the chimney. I could smell the dinner he referred to, long before we reached the doorstep. Bob went through the door and announced that he'd found another hiker who'd invited back for dinner and a bed for the night. I followed along and came upon the family in the kitchen. I can't really remember the names of the people I was introduced to. There was Bob's wife, his parents, and a late teenage boy who I took to be his son. I did remember the other adult male that was there called Tom. I had no idea if he was a relation or friend or what. As we sat down to dinner, Tom did a lot of talking while the others were quiet. He was jovial and very knowledgeable about the trail. I thanked them after we'd eaten, and I was so tired that Bob immediately said, "I'll show you where you can sleep." I said my good nights and headed upstairs with Bob. The room was nice, exactly like you would imagine a farmhouse bedroom. I laid down my stuff, thanked Bob, and said good night. Not surprisingly, I was asleep pretty much before my head hit the pillow. I had no idea how long I'd been out cold before I suddenly came half awake. I was aware of a low, humming noise, but was still half dreaming. Over a few seconds, the humming noise became clear in my mind as humming voices. I looked up, and as my blurry eyes adjusted to the darkness, I thought I saw dark figures. I momentarily laid back before suddenly springing fully awake. My mind had warned me of danger, and I suddenly switched on. Standing before me were 6 hooded figures in dim candlelight. I let out an involuntary cry, whereupon one figure removed their hood. It was Tom, his face now completely changed from his earlier jovial self. "Stay where you are," he snarled. "You'll come with us." Fortunately for me, I'd fallen asleep almost fully clothed, without shoes but with socks. I sprang out of bed and charged the middle of the group as they were barring my way out. Hands grabbed at me. Some weaker grips, probably older or female, grabbed at me that I was able to shake off. Then 2 stronger arms grabbed. I reared up an elbow, hitting someone in the face. Then I stomped on the other assailant's foot. Both screamed in pain. I took my opportunity and charged through the door. As I ran down the stairs, I heard Tom shout, "Don't let the pig get away!" The front door was initially locked, but I fumbled for the latch, opening the door just in time to slam it in the fastest pursuer's face. As I ran down the lane towards the trail, the same pursuer, who I took to be the young man, was gaining on me. So I turned round and jabbed him hard in the face, putting him down. This bought me enough time to get back to the trail. I ran like the wind for several hundred meters before veering off into the woods. Then spent the remainder of the dark and cold night in breathless terror. At first light, I heard and saw some hikers approaching. I must have looked like a wild man when I jumped out on them. After the initial shock, I breathlessly told them my story, and within a couple of hours, local police came to meet me on the trail. It turned out that the farmhouse was an Airbnb that hadn't yet been opened for the season. By the time the police got there, they found no one, and not even the gear I'd abandoned. They had no idea how these people knew it was unoccupied, or how they'd gained access. Quite honestly, I'm not sure they believed my story of some weird cult preying on hitchhikers, but I know what happened. They did admit they currently had an open case of a lone hiker who had gone missing a week earlier, but doubted the two incidents were connected. Once I got back to civilization, Jim was incredibly apologetic, blaming himself for my terrifying experience. I told him not to worry, and we're still big pals today, although we pick our hiking trips much more carefully. California has some of the greatest trails and national parks anywhere. I think the only ones I found that were more stunning were probably Zion in Utah, so I spend a lot of my spare time hiking around there. I've heard of all the missing 411 stories and the disappeared all over the country, and all the theories that go with it. I didn't put too much credibility in all of that, but I do know one thing. No matter how much experience you have as a hiker, it's the easiest thing in the world to get lost out there. Last autumn I was out in the trails for a few days. The main thing I was concerned about was bears. They were getting closer to hibernation, so if there wasn't enough food around, they could get really aggressive. I had bear spray, for what that was worth. I set off to hike a forested area I hadn't been to before. There was a pretty comprehensive network of well-marked paths there, so it wasn't that easy to get lost, except if you stepped off into the deep woods. I spent the first night at a campsite. It was relatively close to civilization and there were plenty of people around, so that was all very uneventful. On the second day, I left the campground and went deeper into the woods. I saw a few people now and then, but it had really thinned out. As the woods got deeper, it was darker overhead, even on a sunny day, so it was down to only the serious woodsmen now. Late in the afternoon, I needed to answer the call of nature. I'd done it a few times already. I just walked 10 yards or so into the bush, where I wouldn't inflict the sight of it on anyone else. Always keeping the trail directly in front of me, so even in woods this deep, it was hard to get lost. As I was finishing up, I heard some disturbance from behind me and to the left. There was a rustle of undergrowth, and then what sounded like a growl. Instantly, I felt a strange presence. It was hard to explain. All at once, I saw what appeared to be a strange light. At first, I thought it was sunlight breaking through the branches, but it was like a pale fluorescent beam that fell on the leaves around me. I felt fear and staggered away from the area. The noise and the light seemed to follow me, and I ran further away. Looking back, it seemed like there was some strange electrical type disturbance in the woods behind me, following slowly, distorting the leaves and branches. I was feeling pretty terrified now, and stampeded my way as fast as I could back into the woods. I'd managed to put some distance between myself and whatever had spooked me back there. Shaking a little with fear, I stopped and watched. The strange disturbance was in one spot now, moving ever so slightly back and forth, as if unsure where to go. It crossed my mind that perhaps if I stood still, whatever it was couldn't follow me. I heard the strange growl again, which certainly helped to freeze me to the spot. I was transfixed, so I don't know how long I was standing there, but eventually, slowly but surely, the terrifying force lurking in the bushes faded away. I breathed a huge sigh of relief. Thinking I was in the clear, I had a sudden realization. I'd run too far back into the woods and now had no idea where the trail was. It was almost as dark as night where I was, deep in those woods. Fortunately, I had a compass and a geolocation device, from which I could both locate the trail or send out a distress signal for rescue. The problem was, if I turned the location device on, the screen would light up and it would make occasional noises. Whatever had petrified me beforehand might be able to zero in on it and follow me again. But there was nothing else for it. I had to get back to the trail. I was a sitting duck for whatever was out there, and I wasn't about to spend the night trapped in deep woods, crapping myself. I resolved that I would turn it on, get a quick read of where I needed to go, then run like hell. Seemed like it took forever for my device to come on, quickly locate me, and give me a bearing to safety. I took off running, but as I did, I heard that same terrifying disturbance near me in the forest. This time, accompanied by an angry roar that seemed almost subliminal, barely audible to the ear, but terror-inducing. I crashed through the woods as fast as I could. All the while, the mysterious force came closer and closer. With a sudden burst of light, I stumbled onto the trail and kept running for my life. When it became clear that I wasn't being followed anymore, I stopped, gasping for breath. Feeling safer, I walked up the trail a little and found my gear. Wasting no time, I headed back to the campsite, walking through darkness until I got there, then crashed for the night, the presence of others giving me some sense of security. I didn't tell anyone about what I'd experienced, but a little later, I heard an interview with a guy who was talking about disappearances and missing 411 on the internet. He was asking for people who had had strange experiences to contact him for research purposes. I thought about it for a while, then eventually contacted him by email. After I told my story, he said that I'd probably been stalked by a cryptid or some sort of animal not yet identified by science. Now, just a few short weeks before, I would have laughed at the very idea of that. But I certainly can't explain what happened to me that day. And I'll be making sure I never step more than a few feet off trail for the rest of my life. The story I'm about to tell happened to me way back in the late 1980s. I've been camping since before then, and I still camp today. I live in the UK and have camped all around the country, as well as around Europe. Never really had any issues and really enjoyed myself. This all happened one late summer. The whole summer had been crap. Lots of rain, biting winds. If you get a bad summer in the UK, it's bad alright. That certainly wasn't going to stop me from camping. I decided I'd go up to Scotland. People often complained about the weather up there, but it didn't really matter, since it was crap everywhere at the time. Those were the good old days of hitchhiking, so after a train up there, I was able to get around by thumbing a lift. I camped in a few spots, then decided to head for a forest park in the Highlands, which I won't name. It was spectacular up there, views of small inland lakes and wooded glens, long sweeping roads to roam. The first day I hiked well into the park, and really had the place to myself, probably because of the weather, although I did see one or two hardy fellow hikers. In the late afternoon, the drizzle started to get heavier. I'd heard on my trusty battery-operated radio that the forecast wasn't too clever, so I pitched my tent in a fire break and set up camp. By the time the light had faded, I'd already fried up some bacon on the camp stove, leaning out of the tent while cozily wrapped up in my sleeping bag. I had a small lamp outside the tent once it got dark, which I then pulled inside with me when I decided to do some reading before going to sleep. After a few pages, I wasn't really feeling it, so I turned the radio on. Reception was a bit spotty, but I tuned into a local station just as the news came on. There was a big story in the local region. Apparently a dangerous psychopath had escaped from an institution for the criminally insane. Authorities were warning that under no circumstances should he be approached, as he was violent and highly dangerous. That instantly sent a shiver up my spine, although when they named the institution, I knew that was a good few miles from here. Still, it was a little unsettling when they said police believed he was roughing it in the countryside, and he'd been on the lam for a few days. As I started to drift into sleep, I turned off the radio and the lamp. It was a moonless night, and out here, it was as quiet and as dark as the grave, except for the occasional wind and rustling of the trees. I slept well until sometime later there was a sudden crackling of branches in the undergrowth. I shot awake, knowing that this was not a wandering sheep or some other Highland animal. Something bipedal, probably human, was striding slowly through the forest beyond and moving closer and closer to my tent. After a few moments' thought, with my heart pounding, I decided there was nothing else for it. I picked up the light, slipped on my boots, and headed outside. Clicking the light on as I unzipped the tent, I was relieved to see nothing directly outside, and I carefully turned the light to the side. Still nothing. I sprang out of the tent in case anyone or anything was waiting, but still there was nothing there. Now I'd stood up, and was able to defend myself if necessary. Slowly pointing the light at the darkness beyond, I turned 360 degrees. After I'd gone about 180, I heard a sudden crack off to my right, and some sort of grunt. I shone the light towards where the noise came from, just in time to see a human figure dash off into the darkness, branches cracking. At least, I think it was a human figure. I decided to say something, and was terrified by how weak my voice sounded. "Piss off," I tried to shout. "I'm armed over here." That was a lie, of course, but I felt like I might as well bluff it. There was stillness out there again. I retreated to the front of the tent with the light and sat there, too hyped up to go back to sleep. But as time wore on, I was nodding off again. I decided whoever or whatever it was had to have moved on. I went back inside and got back into my sleeping bag. Turning the lamp down as low as it would go, I was out cold again within moments. What happened next was something of a blur. I began waking up to the sound of someone running, footsteps charging up the forest trail, closer and closer, until they halted right outside the tent. I came to my senses just as the tent was unzipped from the outside. In the low light, I saw a wild-looking bearded figure who let out a roar as the zip came down. Instinctively, I roared back and kicked out, striking the figure who held back just for a moment. I had time to feel fear in that instant, but instinct kicked in again, and I continued kicking. All at once I heard the barking of dogs and men's voices close by. The figure let out another roar and took off running. I slid out of the tent just in time to see him charging down the trail as light flooded in from behind me. Dogs and policemen ran past the tent. Then one sergeant veered off and came over to see me. "Are you all right, lad?" he boomed. "Yes, sir," I said. The policeman stayed with me until other policemen soon arrived. One of them said to me, "You've had a lucky escape there, son. That maniac meant to do you in and take your stuff." I thanked him and his colleagues for arriving just in time. It was then that the shock and realisation hit me of how close I'd come to danger. It was on my mind for a while, but within months, I was back camping, convinced that this was my one and only brush with terror in the great outdoors. I work as a security guard at a quarry about 10 miles outside of the town where I live. I started there about 3 months ago and was immediately stuck on the night shift. New hires had to do their time there until a more longer-term employee left. Then I'd be able to do days. It sucked, of course, but in this economy, I had to remind myself I was lucky to have a job. The quarry was in a very isolated location, and at night, I was out there by myself from 11 p.m. until another guy showed up at 7 a.m. I'd never had any trouble and was trained to just look out for thieves, as there was a lot of valuable equipment and metals there that would be attractive to criminals. One night a few months ago, I was driving into work in the teeth of a horrible rainstorm. It had been forecast, but somebody had to go into work at the quarry, and that somebody was me. I arrived at the tin shack by the quarry gate, and after parking, charged indoors through the heavy rain. The other guy, Dan, laughed as I came in, seeing me soaked just from running across the road. He got up to get his coat and said, "Enjoy your walk-arounds." That lucky sod had done all this before the rains came. As Dan left, I resolved that no way was I doing any rounds in this weather. So there I was, sitting in the security shack, listening to the rain belting off the roof. I took out a book I'd been reading and settled in to try and finish it. At some stage, I nodded off. I awoke with a start, having heard some sort of bang, and assumed it was the book hitting the floor, although it sounded way too loud for that, almost like a sonic boom from outside. So I assumed that it was just my mind playing tricks. Then there was a small flash of light at the corner of my vision. Again, I thought this was an artifact of me waking up. However, when I turned round and looked out the window, I could see a reflection where everything should have been pitch black. My heart pumped faster, as I was convinced that there must have been thieves outside who had picked this horrible weather night to steal, thinking that security might not be on site. Now, I wasn't ever going to tackle a bunch of potentially armed thieves while I was making minimum wage, but if I was able to identify that that was what was taking place, I was to call the police and sound an alarm, which would have made a lot of noise around the quarry, hopefully scaring anyone off. Arriving at the window, I was surprised to see that the light was in fact from lights in the sky, reflecting down upon the shack. Looking up, I couldn't really see what was going on. Lights were flitting around above the building, and I couldn't tell whether they were near or far. I'd become pretty much transfixed until all at once the lights stopped, plunging the area into blackness again. Once again, the only sound was rain hammering on the roof. Seemingly from nowhere, another sound came. It was a low moan, quiet but all-encompassing, feeling like it was right beside me. Right, I said to myself. Someone's messing me around and playing tricks on me. I picked up my torch and put on my jacket and stormed outside, determined to confront whoever it was that was pranking me, regardless of the downpour. Stepping out to the gate and standing on the road into the quarry, I shone my flashlight into the darkness and circled round. When the light fell on the shack, the moaning started again. This time when I heard it, it sounded more sinister, less human. Now I started to get scared. It was accompanied by a strange scuttling noise, like something large struggling through undergrowth. That was enough for me. Being only a few yards from my car, I sprinted through the rain, hand shaking as I tried to unlock it and get in. I hit the gas and steamed forward, driving round the gate and probably damaging the undercarriage of the car. But I dare not get out again. Looking back, I thought I saw a hulking figure in the dim light near the shack. I stepped on it again and my heart didn't stop pounding until I was home. Phoning the supervisor at the security company, I breathlessly told my story. He was furious that I'd abandoned the post, and I got furious back, telling him what he could do with his job. He demanded I call the police, but I answered that that was his problem, since I'd just quit. I never heard another thing about the whole situation. I don't know what the hell was going on out there that night, but I'd rather be unemployed than go through that type of thing ever again. Being a 25-year-old female in the city isn't easy these days. I graduated university and was full of hope, but my university degree wasn't the most useful when it came to finding well-paid work. I'd done a tour of duty as a barista, which was pretty soul-destroying, not least because I couldn't afford my own place and had to share with others, which I hated. Eventually I found an office job which, while not providing me with a spectacular paycheck, was in theory enough to enable me to finally get my own place. In theory, anyway. I looked around and places I liked were either gone or there was just so much competition that I lost out. I started to move further and further out of town, but still couldn't find anything. I came across an ad for a duplex where both units were empty. Surely this was somewhere I could finally get. I drove out one evening after work and was increasingly disappointed as I got closer. The area had been described as up and coming, but it looked really dodgy. Worse still, my GPS led me up a deserted laneway back off the road, with only 2 buildings at the end of it, and then just fields around. The landlord was standing outside, and I don't know if he sensed my discomfort, but he tried to be welcoming and chatty. Going inside, it was surprising to find that the place was really nice, redeveloped inside and pristine, shining new. I was so impressed, and this overcame my reservations about the neighbourhood. I asked some questions about the place to the landlord, and he confirmed that the upstairs unit was empty, but he'd taken someone's deposit and was waiting to sign a lease. So it was the ground floor or nothing. He told me that the duplex across the road was also empty and was slated to be redeveloped. I had to think about things, but I knew then and there that this was the place for me. Not least because I'd had such horrible luck finding somewhere else I could afford. You can't have everything. I took the unit then and there. I was determined to make the best of it, and it was a nice place inside. A few days later, I loaded up my car because I didn't have too many possessions at the place that I was sharing. I ordered a bed and made do with an air mattress for the first few days. It wasn't going to be too much of a hardship, given how well appointed the place was inside. Moving in Friday, I was tired that first night and crashed out. I did hear a few raised voices outside and what sounded like a few altercations, which disturbed me. But that was how this area was after dark. It seemed a lot safer in the daytime when I did some exploring on the Saturday afternoon, but I was forced back to the apartment after about 3 p.m. when a huge rainstorm blew in. That night I was in the kitchen, watching the rain hammer down. Looking across to the deserted duplex, I was sure I saw a dim light on in the ground floor unit. That's strange, I thought. It's supposed to be empty. I thought maybe it was light reflected in the rain, but there definitely seemed to be a small glow inside the unit. I know this was a dumb thing to do, but I decided that since there was no one around because of the rainstorm, I'd put on my raincoat and put up my umbrella and stroll across to take a quick look. The rain was absolutely sheeting down out there. As I got closer, there was no mistake. There was definitely a candle or some small light in the lower unit across the way. I got a little closer and peered ahead. Then, to my horror, a hideous growling face popped up in the window. I screamed and ran back to my unit. Getting inside, I was relieved but almost hyperventilating with fear. Who on earth was across there? I didn't have time enough to discern the features, only that the face was horrifying. Pulling the blinds and dimming the light, I looked out the kitchen window again. Sure enough, I could see the outline of the face still in the window. Then it disappeared. Could that horrible figure be coming across the road? I decided to hunker down in the darkness and wait. A few minutes later, I heard scuffling outside my window and saw a shadow pass across. My heart dropped and began beating furiously. What had I done? Retreating away from the window, I made sure my door was locked. Just seconds after I did, I saw the handle move slowly up and down, then rattle a little more urgently. Terrified, I ran to the bedroom, locked the door and phoned 911. I was lucky that night. Within a few minutes, the police were on scene. I heard a commotion, and shortly afterwards, officers were knocking on my door. The figure had been captured, and it turned out he was a wanted man on the run, suspected of murder, who'd broken into the condemned duplex just that night. My heart shook, and I had a few very rough nights after that, waking up in a cold sweat. The police were wonderful to me, and for some time after, they used to swing by in the evening and shine a light around. I've put the whole thing behind me, and a little while after, I got a better job, found a great man, and we moved in together. Sometimes I look back on that night, though, and shiver at the thought of it. I've been a highway cop for a number of years. I like the freedom of driving the roads, even though I have to go to calls just like any other cop. Getting an emergency and putting the lights on to speed down mostly deserted highways is a job I love. One night there was a huge storm over our area while I was on duty. We were expecting a lot of calls related to drivers getting stuck or coming off the road in the terrible driving conditions, and there were a few of those to begin with. Then the worst of the storm seemed to blow out, and the calls largely did too. Other than that, Everyone had expected the storm, so there wasn't many out on the roads and not too many of the usual type of calls either. One did come in that was unexpected though. A driver and a tow truck guy, who pulled him out of a ditch, called in that they'd heard a woman screaming in a dark area of the highway, surrounded by woods. I caught the call, and I certainly had some questions. First, I wanted to know if the driver and the tow truck guy were still there. Dispatch told me no. They'd apparently freaked out and hightailed it out of there, getting a GPS of where they'd heard it, and making the call after they'd put some distance between themselves and the location. Were they sure they'd heard screaming? I wanted to know. Apparently so, and it had scared them. I asked if we had any backup and was told no one was available, or close enough. I put the lights on and booted it down the road as fast as the horrible weather conditions would allow me. Despite hustling, it still took me about 15 minutes to get there in the smashing rain. I was thinking that if anyone was getting killed out here, it would have happened long before I managed to arrive. I pulled the cruiser onto the hard shoulder and listened for a moment. All I could hear was rain. I called into dispatch and let them know that I was on scene and was getting out to take a look. I opened the door to a mass of rain flooding in. It was horrible, but I was a cop and this was my job, so out I got. I could barely see the forest by the side of the highway. Walking up to the guardrail, I shone my torch into the trees. Like a direct reaction to the light, a blood-curdling scream rang out, chilling my already chilled bones even further. I guess it sounded like a woman's scream, but also vaguely like an animalistic cry. I understood why the driver and the tow truck guy were freaked out. Once again, this was my job, so I girded my loins and stepped off-road into the woods. I called out that I was the police and drew my weapon. The screaming continued as I stepped forward, but seemed to move a little further away or become quieter. I followed. Now I started to wonder about the wisdom of going further. The scream seemed more and more not like a woman, and more not human. I made the decision to switch off my torch, even though I was plunged into total darkness. The screaming stopped. It took all my fortitude to stand there as the rain hammered down in the woods. Then I turned my torch back on, and the screaming started up all over again. Now I knew, whatever was out there, I was pretty sure it wasn't a woman. As if to emphasize my fears, when I turned and began to walk away to the cruiser, a much lower guttural growl came from within the woods. I quickened up my pace and got back to the cruiser. Staying professional, I made the call to dispatch and told them that whatever was out there was some sort of animal and not a woman. That didn't truly tell the story. It wasn't any kind of animal I've ever heard, before or since. Not everyone's cut out for police work. I am, and I certainly don't scare easy, but that night was weird. And for all the dangerous calls I've been on over the years, I never once thought that I was dealing with anything other than a human being. Until that night. Me and a friend went to Vegas for a few days recently. We had a good night on the Friday night after we arrived. Too good as it turned out. He woke up sick as a dog the next day and could hardly move, let alone get out of bed. I did what I could to make sure he was comfortable, and then he urged me to get out for a walk, that there was no point in me sitting around there all day in a hotel room. I asked him if he was sure, and he was pretty insistent, so off I went. We were staying near the top end of the strip, so I decided to walk to Fremont Street, since I had a bit of time on my hands and absolutely nothing to do. Now, as anyone who's been to Vegas knows, there are quite a few dodgy areas once you get off the strip. It's fine during the day, but there are a lot of homeless, drugs, and fallen women around. I don't look like a mark generally, so I figured I wouldn't have a problem. And I didn't. At least, not in the way I thought. Not far from Fremont, I was walking past a little row of tiny shop units, real hole-in-the-wall places. I was strolling quite slowly and taking in the names of the stores in these units that weren't empty. One caught my eye. It was called Madame ZZ with a sign saying, "Discover your fortune," and a list of services such as tarot cards and all the usual stuff. The outside of the unit was decorated with all sorts of astrological and occult signs. The price was $20, and with a sick friend who wasn't available to go out, I had money burning a hole in my pocket. It was all a load of nonsense, of course, but this was Vegas, and this was the sort of nonsense that Vegas was all about. I smiled to myself and stepped into the unit. The door closed behind me, and there was complete silence. Inside the unit was tiny and claustrophobic, adorned with Eastern and mystic decor. There was a table with a crystal ball and tarot cards. I stood for a moment and no one appeared from the back. Eventually I cleared my throat and said, "Hello?" Still nothing. Then eventually there was some shuffling from the back room, and a tiny woman emerged, complete with Eastern shawl and headdress, the whole 9 yards. I was trying not to laugh. "You want your fortune?" she croaked gruffly. I said yes. "It's $20, she demanded. I handed it over, and we sat down at the table to get started. She was giving it the whole routine, staring into the crystal ball and dealing cards. She started talking about me, my age, details about my life, and all of it was wrong. I stupidly said, "I like the act, but none of what you're saying is right." She fixed me with a face like thunder, and after an awkward silence said, "There is no act." She continued to look at me for another awkward moment, then said, "Is your friend feeling better yet?" I'm not going to lie, I was taken aback. She could have guessed it, I thought, but then she continued dealing cards and telling me things about family and friends in my life that were right on the money. Worse still, she began talking about the future, my future, and it wasn't good. It pains me even now to think about what was predicted. Lots of horrible things that I wouldn't even mention. I got rattled and said, "Shut up, you old bag," and stormed out. Her bitter laughter was ringing in my ears as I left. That night, I told my friend about it, and he was fascinated. By the next day, he'd made the miracle 24-hour recovery and wanted to go and see this Madame ZZ. I didn't want to go anywhere near it, and eventually we agreed that I would show him where it was, but not go in. We got an Uber up to where the little shop units were. To my complete amazement, the unit where Madame ZZ was the day before was now empty, with a "To Let" sign on the door. My friend wasn't amused and thought I'd pranked him, but I swore blind that something weird was going on. I walked up and down the units and was sure I had the right one. My friend could see that I was disturbed, and he didn't think I was that good an actor, so we gave it up and went on with our trip. To this day, I have never been able to put the experience totally out of my mind. One or two of the bad things that the old hag predicted have come true, but none of the really bad stuff. Yet. I'm hoping against hope that she was just exaggerating because I angered her. But now and then, the memory of Madame ZZ comes back to haunt me, and I worry about a potentially horrifying future. I recently had to go to Las Vegas for work, some meetings and a conference which was taking place related to the industry I worked in. I wasn't too happy about it, because I'd never been too fond of Vegas. I wasn't a gambler, and if I wanted to go away for a fun weekend, I would always choose LA or Miami over Vegas. Plus, I was on my own. The conference and the meetings were as tedious as I expected them to be. That left me with time on my hands in the evening, and a bit of a dilemma. Nothing on the strip appealed to me, but I also didn't want to be sitting in a hotel room in the evening for a couple of nights. Strolling around in the hotel lobby on the first evening, I noticed a hotel bar. It was one of those plastic Irish places with a folky Irish band on, but it looked like everyone was having a lot of fun. The next night was a Friday, so I decided then and there that I'd try it then. I went into the place about 7 p.m, and the band was in full swing. There were a number of people around, but by no means full. I had a couple of drinks, and as time went on, the place started to fill up a bit more. I was enjoying the music and the atmosphere and chatting now and then to people at the bar. It was getting more full now, and these two dudes were standing beside me. They were a little eccentrically dressed, which is not unusual in Vegas, of course, and one of them had a handlebar moustache. They started talking to me, and the guy with the handlebar moustache started talking about sports. Out of the blue, he squeezed my upper arm and said, "You look like you play sports, do you?" I was very uncomfortable and said, not really, not anymore. I'm very liberal about all that stuff, but I'm not that way inclined either, so I didn't want anyone getting the wrong idea. I turned away and tried to give the impression that I was done talking. I ordered another drink and sat it beside me while I watched the band and clapped along. The handlebar moustache guy was still trying to talk to me, and I got fed up and walked away towards the crowd that had gathered next to the band. I was enjoying myself there for a few minutes, only for this guy to suddenly appear at my shoulder again. I was getting pretty annoyed now. He said to me, "What happens now?" I said, "What?" He repeated, "What happens now?" I said, "Nothing. Now get lost." I turned to walk away, but as I did so, my legs started feeling very weird. At the same time, my head was starting to get a little cloudy. The guy said to me, "I'll help you," and I told him to F off. It must have been quite loud because some people in the immediate vicinity noticed the commotion, and the guy backed off. I stumbled out of the bar as quickly as I could and towards the elevator up to my room. Everything was getting really slow motion, and my legs were barely responding to commands. At one point, I turned around and saw the creep walking along behind me again, following me. I tried to yell at him to F off again. I'm not sure how it came out, but people were looking around again and the guy backed off. By now I'd got to the elevator and showed my room key to the security guy. He probably just thought I was really drunk, which was common there, of course. Thank God the elevator came quickly. I'm not even sure how I found my room, but I have a vague memory of locking the door and crashing out. That was it for me. I woke up the next morning with an almighty headache and still very woozy, and had trouble moving around. I stuck the Do Not Disturb sign on the door and blew out the last day of the conference. I was feeling pretty bad, but decided against getting any medical attention as I was slowly improving. I also decided not to take the matter any further, even though I was angry. All I wanted to do was get straight and get home. For all I know, the creeps weren't even staying at this hotel. I was straightened out the next morning and was so glad to fly home. All I can say is, man or woman, watch your drinks at all times. Don't even turn your back for a second, especially in a place like Las Vegas. I'm a 28-year-old female dealer at one of the casinos in Vegas. I make a good living. I suppose I would be considered attractive, and that can sometimes work in my favour. I've had some very big tips from some high rollers and people who have won big. I also get asked out at times by guys. I rarely do, but sometimes I've dated guys I met at work. Recently I was at work and a high roller came to my table. He was a heavy middle-aged guy called Bob and was a real big gambler who played blackjack. He was very chatty as soon as he got to the table. Between hands, he was telling me about his businesses, about how much money he'd made in his life. He also talked about how successful he'd been at cards. I'd heard this all before, of course, so I just smiled and chatted a bit. He was certainly a good blackjack player, and he won quite big the first night. He was very pleased with himself and dropped me a pretty big tip when he left the table, which is always nice. I thought no more about it until the next evening, when Bob appeared at my table again. He was chatty once more and called me by my name. I made nice with him, but was getting a bit uncomfortable, especially when he said I was his lucky charm. He was high rolling again and tipped well again, but this time he asked me out as he was leaving. I said I had a boyfriend and didn't date customers, both of which were untrue, but I just wanted to end the situation. He seemed alright about it. The next night he came in, but went to a different table not far from me. A few times I caught him looking over at me. It wasn't a pleasant look either, and once again I was feeling uncomfortable. That night when I finished work, I went to the underground car park, which is always slightly creepy when there's no one else around. As I got into my car, I saw a car across the lot turn on its engine and lights. I told myself I was being paranoid, so I just drove out of the car park and kept my eyes peeled. The car followed me out and followed me onto the highway as I headed for my place in Henderson. I was starting to get a little scared and contemplated phoning a friend to see what I should do, or even calling the police. The car was still there as I pulled up to my townhouse complex. I parked up and dashed across the lot to my door. When I looked back, I saw the car was at the curb outside the complex. As soon as I got to my door, it slowly pulled away. I realised I'd been stupid, and if I was being followed, that person now knew where I lived. Going inside my place, I was really anxious and afraid, but ultimately I was also really tired. It wasn't long before I fell asleep. I don't know how much later it was, but I awoke with a start when I heard a noise coming from outside my bedroom, like someone walking around on the lawn. I suddenly realised to my horror that I had left the sliding door in my living room unlocked. It was the really hot time of the year, and sometimes I used to crack it open. I was out of bed like a sprinter. I made it to the living room and flicked the lock down, just as I thought I saw a shadow on the lawn outside. My heart was pounding now, and I sprang across the room to make sure I'd locked my front door. As I did, I thought I saw a shadow again, moving across the doorway. I dare not open the door to check, but stayed peering out through a crack in the curtains, wondering if I should call the police. It was early morning light now, and I saw a car that looked like the one from earlier drive quickly across the car park and onto the highway. The gathering daylight made me feel a little better, and I was able to get back to bed and sleep a little. When I got into work that night, I went to my supervisor and told him the story about Bob, and then being followed home by someone. He was very understanding and said he would take it up with security and keep an eye out for Bob and see if he was stalking me. As it turned out, Bob didn't come around again, at least as far as they knew. I had a difficult couple of weeks being paranoid and looking over my shoulder, but nothing happened. I'm finishing at the table soon and heading back to my home state. I've made enough money and I'm having a career change and going back into full-time education. But for a little while longer, I'll still have to be on my guard and on the lookout for anyone following me home.